if we frame it right, reestablish it right, then theoretically you don't have folks coming and saying, how do I design a schema for an API that I'm going to build with a running web server? Like, well, maybe I can point you to the right resources, but the experts on that aren't the folks here, even if they know how to solve that problem. You want to go here or here to get some of that information and get started.
This is What the Jam, an interview series where we're finding out what's next for Jamstack. Find out more at thefutureofjamstack.org. I'm joined by Sean C. Davis, Senior Manager, Developer Education at Netlify. And Sean's been heavily involved in the Jamstack community and panels and talks and content creation. So very excited to have him here and talk about Jamstack today. Welcome.
Thank you, Mike. I'm excited to have this chat with you. Really energized by all the conversations that you've been facilitating recently.
Yeah, me too. Let's get it. Start off with the big question. What does Jamstack mean to you?
Ooh, yes, yeah. The spicy one first. I like it. I like
Yeah.
it. It's interesting because I would say that definition, even for me, has evolved over the years. Where um, in those early years, it felt a little bit more clear. It was like, well, we're pre-rendering first. We're building static sites, and we're progressively enhancing that with JavaScript. And then as we went through this, what some folks were calling an identity crisis around maybe 2020, 2021 or so, we saw that definition loosen. And I was kind of grasping for something to anchor me,
Mm.
and to be able to. And at that time, it was near the end of my span of working in agencies, and so what I was also having to do was figure out a way to be able to explain the approach that we were taking through the Jamstack to our prospects and clients. And so
Mm.
so it was always like I needed something to grab onto, and generally went back to the earlier definition and earlier conversations. But as there was some more chatter in the community, I actually started leaning more towards the definition of Jamstack is more about the people and the community and the people building um, modern websites today. But even in the last 3 years, we've seen it change and continue to change and kind of fizzle out. And that's why I'm excited we're having this conversation. But as I think about it today, what is it today? I'd almost turn it a little bit to say, well, how do I think of it? What do I think it should be? And I think it really goes back to this idea of leading with simplicity. And so, um, and that could mean a number of things. And what I'm hoping through these conversations that you're facilitating and kind of reviving this community is that we can set what those guardrails are, and we can definitely talk through those things because I think there's a lot of nuance there. But when I'm approaching a new website, I'm thinking about how can I build this as simply as possible and rely on some of the services that are out there in the wild so that I don't have to manage the infrastructure. Or I can minimize the
Yeah.
amount of infrastructure I'm managing. But generally, yes, if I'm going to add a stricter definition, I think we're talking about something that's more pre-rendered first, delivered through a CDN, progressively enhanced with JavaScript. I mean, I really go back to those early days, and I feel like for a couple of years ago, I got kind of hung up on this site is Jamstack or it's not Jamstack.
Yeah.
But what I've been thinking a lot more recently is we could get more strict with how we're defining this Jamstack as an architecture, but also be okay that you can escape from that. Because, I mean, you can explain something as a monolithic architecture, but you can also have components in there that maybe don't necessarily fit that bill as well.
Yeah, I think that's bang on. And it's interesting before you said anchor. Like I think that's what the definition is. It's something that like this community is always pulled back to. It's like a the center of gravity, but it doesn't mean that you can't. It's like Earth. If you can build a rocket and have enough thrust, you can jump off the Earth. You can have a rocket that goes above the Earth, but you'll always like come back down unless you escape the atmosphere. But
Yeah.
yeah, that wasn't a
Yes.
great analogy.
I'll take it. I'll take it.
So yeah, this idea of how do you think we grapple with that as a community? Because I agree, it's like the most important thing about Jamstack is the people. Um, like if if we're just purely talking about an architecture that a very select few people are doing, it's not particularly interesting. But what is really cool and interesting is a group of people who are very passionate about this approach and sharing ideas and sharing innovation and bringing, yeah, just innovating in this space. So how do you think we grapple with that of trying to have that anchor, but also not being like too dogmatic where it gets to the point of that's not this thing. So like, yeah, it shouldn't be talked about here.
Right, because something that I think you're maybe hinting at is that the one of those core foundations of the community was that it was very inclusive, and that's why it did get kind of hard to draw those boundaries. Like,
Exactly.
at the time, at the time being, say, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, Next.js wasn't a monolithic framework, and so we felt like, oh, okay, yeah, folks who are building with Next
Totally.
are they're welcome here. And so I definitely, that idea of inclusivity resonates with me, and I feel like we can have opinions, but also welcome people who are building something that might be slightly outside those guardrails or the boundaries that we set for that definition. But one thing I've been thinking about recently is that a big part of that shift to or maybe another way to say this is when we started to feel like that definition was loosening, and um, we didn't quite have as much of a grasp on what it meant, was really tied to the features that frameworks were presenting at that time. And so I think one of the key things that we can do, if or maybe that we have to do if we're going to get more opinionated, is to separate the idea of what is Jamstack and what framework are you using?
Yeah,
Because
totally.
yeah, as it got muddier, it was like, well, if you're Next.js can fit that Jamstack pattern. So I guess if you're using Next, you're following the pattern. And now Astro is getting a bunch of attention, and it's becoming server first. So it's like, well, is does Astro fit it? And I think it's okay if we shift the conversation to say you can use an Astro or Next to fit a Jamstack site, but it maybe it or a Jamstack architecture, but it doesn't necessarily do that. Just as if you need a back end for your site that you're gonna fetch data with JavaScript, that you're probably gonna build that with Node or Rails, and you're going to need a running server. And so that part isn't a Jamstack site, but it fits in as a component into your architecture, which you could potentially describe as Jamstack.
Yeah, it's a really great point because a lot of these conversations are so nuanced, right? And
Mhm.
for a newcomer coming in, like you see a picture of the Jamstack ecosystem and you're like, oh, Next.js is in the Jamstack ecosystem. So I guess everything that tool does is Jamstack. And and to your point before on the expanding definition, yeah, it's like a whole lot of tiny little steps of, okay, it's really close to what this is, so it feels like it's part of it. And then there's something else that's really close. And I feel like just if we kept moving that boundary out, that's where you look back and you're like, actually now it's super wide.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
yeah, that's where like just coming back to that idea of an anchor is so important because I think we lost that. Like there's like camps in Jamstack now where there's people who have only developers that have only used like Next.js and live in that world and don't really subscribe to a static first kind of approach, that are all under the same umbrella. So it's hard. You've kind of got two or three different anchors there, and then that splits and divides the community and causes the identity crisis. Um,
Mhm.
yeah, the framework one's tricky. I don't know how to tackle that though. I don't have a good answer because you want to say like these are tools you can use for this approach, but you'll that for a newcomer who's you're pitching to them, you want to be like asterisks. Not everything you do in this tool could be Jamstack, but that's just a lot of information to take. What do you think about that?
That's interesting, and that makes me think, okay, maybe I kept saying architecture, maybe it is less about that, and maybe it's, f philosophy or recommended pattern, because I was also
Yeah.
thinking I was having a chat on Twitter or X or whatever we call it these days with, Jason Langsdorf earlier in the week, about architectural patterns that he's following for the sites that he's building. And what I had specifically asked him is, well, what are you doing for the back end if you need to progressively enhance your site with dynamic information? And he said, I'm usually reaching for just Node or some simple um, JavaScript backend. And so another thing we could think about is, well, what if it isn't? I mean, it's called Jamstack, right? But what if it's not a stack, a core set of principles, and we focus the conversation around those principles? But as you were talking about the inclusivity of the community, part of what we could also talk about is, well, when you need to push the boundaries or when you need to introduce something that we don't usually talk about, we can have a recommendation and we can point you to the right resources, but we're going to focus more on
Yeah.
this approach.
Yeah. I If we could do that, I think that's the holy grail.
If,
And
right? Yeah.
yeah, that's where I think the idea of static first is quite interesting because it, to your point earlier, it's a philosophy and it takes it out of the frameworks and it's more like you think about the the tool, I guess the tooling or the architecture a lot more, where it's like, how can I make this more static? And it's not a given that everything is static. I think that's a much more interesting question than is this Jamstack? What do you think about that?
I agree. And maybe you could even take it a step further, which is to say, wh- or maybe it's just contextualizing that conversation to say that you do want a good developer experience, but at the end of the day, your goal in most cases is to build something that your users want to use and to optimize that experience. And so we believe that generally, if you can start from a place of simplicity, which usually means static or pre rendered content, that you're going to deliver a better experience. And so maybe it's more about that. And if you have that context, and maybe that's more about what are the goals of the community or the
Yeah.
philosophy, that we can say, well, whenever we veer from what those, or maybe it's not veering, maybe it's more like, if you have that context or that mission, then having conversations that float outside of that might be a little bit easier. What do
Mm.
you think?
Yeah. Uh, I think so. Like I'm struggling with my analogies today. It's like I always use vehicle ones for some reason, but I feel like it is a good analogy for simplicity and complexity. Where like let's say we have a bicycle club and um and everyone in there is like, okay, we love biking because it's like it's good exercise, and the bikes are very simple. Like you can just maintain a bike yourself very easily. All of these things kind of that have these shared that club or community has shared values around that. And you can get sub communities in that, like there might be a road bike racing group, or a casual biking around group, or a mountain biking group, but shared ideas around that. But if you're in that community, you're not going to be like, oh, did you hear about Gavin? He used a car to go to the supermarket the other day. Like, how, what an idiot. Like, you just wouldn't unless it was like a pretty extreme group, you wouldn't expect that conversation to happen. It's a group of people that are just passionate about bicycles. And like, I think it's I think we need to get to the same with something around pre-rendering and static sites, where it's it's the same thing. It's like we're passionate about this approach and technology, um, and it doesn't always make sense. It doesn't make sense to move houses, move house with a bike,
Hmm.
and you're
Hmm.
so passionate about bikes that you have to put your like wardrobe on your back and bike it to your new house. Like, no one's no one's saying you need to be that fanatical about it. But yeah, it's just I feel like that comes from the people in the community, and the values, and and what and the moderation as well, and how we have those conversations.
Yes, that's really interesting. So it's almost more like you're suggesting pulling that definition back to focusing on the community and then just needing to define what it is the community is rallying around, perhaps with a bit more opinion than we've had in the past.
That's that's a good way of articulating it, actually. I that's what I personally think. Yeah, I think that's what I think. It is what I think, I should say,
Mhm.
because then we know why we're all here, and we know what we have in common, and we don't need to talk about what it is anymore. We can start talking more about those trade-offs. Does that resonate with you at all? Or yeah, what do you think about that?
It definitely does because you're something that you said really resonated. Where you said the word passion. You were saying they're passionate about bicycles,
Yeah,
and it's an interesting thing because it was almost always, well, people flocked to Jamstack because they were passionate about the approach, or they really saw the value in the approach. And I guess that's maybe assumed in a community in general. Folks gravitate towards that because they're passionate about that thing. But I guess it just it switches the context for me a little bit to say, okay, because then you just have to define what it is those folks are passionate about, and then that contextualizes the majority of the conversations that you'll have in there. Like you said, okay, yeah, people are hopefully, not just bashing on cars because cars would have a purpose. It's just not what the community is focused on. They're just more focused on talking about bicycle usage, or any
exactly.
number of nuances in there. And so if we frame it right, reestablish it right, then theoretically you don't have folks coming and saying, "How do I design a schema for an API that I'm going to build with a running web server?" Like, well, you can do that, and I can point you to the right resources, but the experts on that aren't the folks here, even if they know how to solve that problem. You want to go here or here to get some of that information and get started.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's it. 'Cause, and I don't know how hard that is. Like, it's like sometimes on Reddit you see someone go into the subreddit and post a question, and I feel like if that happens, everyone like really tries to answer it because it's kind of exciting, and
That's
there's
true.
like
Yeah.
there's an outsider in this community, and we want to be welcoming. But as like a general idea, I feel like that that it creates a group of people who are passionate about the same thing, which is really, I think, when Jamstack was Jamstack at its best is what that was it what it was, yeah.
Exactly. And I think you can still have conversations that might be hovering around well, I guess bad term to use here, but I was going to say the edge of what that might be. Because I was thinking I was working for an agency when we caught wind of the Jamstack, and this was late 2017. And the CTO and I were talking about, we think we can cut the cost of development almost in half, and almost overnight. We learned this new framework. At the time it was Gatsby, that was getting a lot of hype. And we did that, and for the average website it was pretty successful.
Mm,
But it worked so well that we also started trying to figure out how we could bring it into enterprise clients. And I think a lot of people have that story, which is why so many of these tools popped up and then um, widened the ecosystem. But that I so I'm saying that because I think that those conversations would also still happen naturally, and you can have really interesting and productive conversations about how to scale sites, how to serve larger sites, even while you're taking this approach that is the thing that is the core of the community, which, as we've talked about today, seems like it probably has something to do with static first.
yeah, agreed. And I think at an enterprise level as well, it's you don't necessarily need to go outside those bounds. Like in these conversations, I'm really trying to wear the community hat, but I'm going to switch to talk about some of our customers at Cloud Cannon, like Twitch and Netflix are some of our biggest customers. And Twitch, we have, I think, 8 or 9 sites, from like documentation to about pages to um, just like education about Twitch, that are all completely static. And there's
Mhm.
not really a reason they need to be. There's a conference website that starts to get into some more serverless functions, but I feel like the long tail of the internet can and probably should be static, including a lot of enterprise websites. Like if there's nothing dynamic about like a blog or documentation or something, like why have dynamic functionality there? Um, but yeah, I feel like it's the same thing. Like an enterprise is naturally going to probably push towards more dynamic for anything outside of those use cases. But those are interesting conversations to have in the community as well.
Yeah, and still today, one of the biggest clients we had at that agency, I mean, they were mostly it was mostly media sites, and there were some smaller ones in there too, and they were really interesting problems to solve. But the ecosystem was so limited in that 2018 time period that we had to be really creative with how we were minimizing build times and
Yeah,
orchestrating race conditions across different sites. And there's more tools at our disposal to solve some of those more complex problems and patterns today, but the the goal behind them still exists, and it's I want to get the content to my users as fast as possible.
yeah, yeah. And it's an interesting path we went down with build speed as well, because I think like we went down the ISR path where you pre-render like a core part of the site, and then the long tail of 1,000 pages you render dynamically the first time, then it's cached. So you have small build time but a little bit of dynamic rendering. Like, I think that's a good approach to solving that problem, but I think there should be a lot more focus on, let's make the build faster. Like how fast can we make that build where you just don't need to do that, and really try and stay in a static world if we can.
For sure, and because I think so many folks had that problem, the tooling now compared to 6 or 7 years ago is amazing. Because we were using Jekyll, and it was a series of Jekyll sites, and it was like, I mean, it was kind of it might have even been worse than linear, but we'll just call it a
Yeah.
linear growth. You add a piece of content, you made the build this much longer. Now with these tools like ES Build and several other um, uh, similar sorts of tools that some are built with Rust, and we've just there's so much more that we didn't really have or didn't really know about at that time, where that the build probably doesn't increase in a linear way, or if it does, that it's just the slope is so much more narrow, and that's
Yeah.
really great because I think we can then focus maybe on the bigger issues that we have today, but even though we're still trying to minimize those build times.
Yeah. And it's like trying to solve as many problems as we can in a static world. And
Mhm, mhm.
some of those problems will never be solvable in a static world. If you have something that needs to be dynamic, it has to have dynamic rendering. But
Yep.
for these things that eventually end up static, like that should all be fair game to put in a static world. We just need more innovation and technology to make that happen.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see where some of those conversations go because for example, I'm building an application right now, heavily dynamic application, and the it's one of the first times I've tried to do this with the well, not necessarily a Jamstack pattern, but more, I'll just say modern frameworks. And I reached for Astro and am just using entirely server side rendering because the authentication pattern, which first of all, I mean, that's a whole other conversation where I ended up building it up from scratch because that was still challenging today, even with
Mm,
server side rendering. But it seems significantly easier because I could store some of that information on the server and not expose that to the
yeah.
client. And so it's like that sort of it would be interesting, I should say, to shift that conversation and say, well, instead of me choosing this server first approach, because I know I need to solve a problem like authentication and real time data and all of those things that usually go hand in hand with reaching for a server, to instead think, okay, but I want to what if we tried to solve this problem today, 6 years later, um, with a static first approach? Is it easier to do that? How would we approach authentication in this world and that sort of things? And it would be, um, yeah, it's just more just anecdotal. It would be interesting to have that conversation, and it would be totally different, I think, than it was last time I had considered it 4 to 6 years ago.
Mm, yeah. I imagine it would be a like spa versus server side rendering conversation at the end of the day, which
I think so.
yeah, there's like pros and cons to both. And um yeah, there's like with anything that there's often never like a right solution. It's like what trade-offs do you want to make on your solution? And
Mhm.
maybe some of the trade-offs on one side make more sense than the other side. But
Yes,
yeah, it's not
great
always
way to
clear.
put that.
So
Ah,
let's come back to the name of Jamstack. What do you think about uh, there's kind of three paths that keep coming up in these conversations. So I want to pitch all three to you and see what you think. For the name, keep keep Jamstack. It's it's a well-known term and people generally kind of know what it means. The downside is it has a lot of baggage. The definition
mhm.
has changed multiple times, and this would likely, I mean, it almost certainly would be another change, which for a portion of that computer, the web developer community will be like, eye roll, changing it again. Yeah. Option two, pre-baked. It's kind of a reference to Aaron Swartz's 2003 blog post of bake, don't fry. Um, and it's just the idea of pre-building sites essentially.
Mhm.
And then option 3 is static first. So that's more about the philosophy that you were talking about before of the process of trying to get to as static as possible, but not yeah, it's not absolute in that you must be static. Yeah, what do you think about those three?
I think that the static, I feel like the one I would throw out first would be static first, because if we go back to the beginning of why Matt Billman coined the Jamstack, it was because the term static was not resonating with people who wanted to build serious websites with this
Yeah,
pattern. So it felt like he identified that problem 9 years ago or so. So it feels like introducing the term static probably brings some of that, that baggage that Matt was trying to shed at that time
yeah,
back into it.
yeah. Baggage everywhere, eh?
Baggage everywhere. Yes. Yes. Yeah, I've thought the same thing about Jamstack. In fact, I posted, I think I shared the post you had about the first panel that you did on Twitch, and someone that I've been connected with in the space, and have had discussions about the definition of Jamstack. Kind of did it. He did the eye roll. He was like, "Oh, we're back to this again." I wouldn't, I don't know that I would get into it. I don't think it doesn't seem productive to get into Jamstack conversations again today. So you definitely have that contingent of folks who are jaded by the conversations that were happening a couple years ago. Um, and so to me, the trade-off is: are you are you willing to lose those folks who would give you that eye roll, and he probably wouldn't come back in, or would take some serious convincing
Yeah,
over time to come back in. And that trade-off would be for the benefit of what you suggested, is you have this established term that you can leverage. Um, I will say I like the name Prebaked is interesting in that it's still, it does two things where i- it's kind of hinting at it, you can pull meaning from it, but also it's not, you don't have to take the term literally as well, which is, so I do like that. And I think there's another potential trade-off with Jamstack as a name, which we had sort of alluded to earlier, and that is that we're not really talking about a stack.
yeah.
And I know it's been a complaint, and it's why the acronym changed from an acronym to just a term. So there's that bit of baggage too. Um, I do this a lot, but I'm like, it's the classic. It depends. I'm kind of hovering on the fence.
Me too.
I
I
think
switch between all three camps all the time.
yes, yes. I think I would definitely be between one and two. I I almost feel like maybe it would be more productive to keep Jamstack around because you have this existing contingent and um, brand identity there, and recognition in the community. And once you bring folks back together and kind of reestablish what we're doing, because I mean, even people who are engaged and have been watching the work that you've been doing, the conversations you've been having, are doing it because you're using the term Jamstack.
Exactly.
And so you could also do that, reestablish that community, and then reassess as things are going, and saying, maybe it needs a shift with name or branding, or something like that. So I think if I had to pick, I would start by staying with Jamstack, and then but being continuing to have that skepticism, and keeping your ear
Mm,
open to, how is this going?
mm. Yeah, no, that's a good answer. I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, Sean, this is an awesome conversation. I feel like just in my thinking, like we've unlocked a lot today, just about the like deep philosophies behind Jamstack. So thank you so much for joining.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. And I feel the same way. I'm like, I talk about this all the time, but then you have a different kind of conversation with somebody else, and it's just like it feels like an evolution, which I think is really good. It feels like we're building toward something.
That's it. That's it for today's interview. Find out more at thefutureofjamstack.org.